They're incredibly prolific. I don't know how they do it. Daniel and Robert can, write articles, multiple articles every day, 7 days a week. So it's thank you both for being here, and thank you for everything you do for the center. As I mentioned, Robert is the director of Jihad Watch and a Shulman Fellow. He's the author of 29 books. The book that he's here to just talk about tonight is the 29th book. And I want to, just a quick aside, C-SPAN is here covering. We haven't had C-SPAN in a long time. We're honored to have them come. They're going to be covering Robert's talk about his new book. The reason why I mention that, other than plugging C-SPAN, is when we do the Q&A, we have a standing mic over there. So if anyone has a question, I'm going to ask everyone to make a line at the microphone. We won't do the walking around with the mic. It's much easier for the coverage, for the film coverage, to have people standing at the mic. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Robert has led seminars on Islam and Jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, the United States Army Command, and General Staff College. He's spoken to the Justice Department and a number of government offices. I put an asterisk by this because Robert has not been invited in recent years to speak to these departments, but hopefully with the new sheriff in town in Washington, D.C., we're hoping that Robert will be invited again to speak for the FBI on terrorism, Central Command, and all of those departments. He's a regular columnist for PJ Media, and of course, as I mentioned, Front Page Mag. He's written hundreds of articles. He's appeared on BBC, Fox News, CNN, a number of networks. Robert is incredibly prolific with the media. He's been a featured speaker, I don't know, Robert, at least 100, couple hundred campuses. He was supposed to speak at UCLA. I think that was just last year, maybe a year and a half ago. They had to cancel the talk because they were worried about it. It was okay for the pro-Palestinians to basically take over the campus grounds, but they couldn't stand having Robert Spencer speak on campus, so they canceled that, really, I think that afternoon when he was supposed to speak. In fact, I think Robert was either there or on his way to UCLA. UCLA, no surprise, got cold feet and canceled Robert Spencer. We will never cancel Robert Spencer to speak for the Freedom Center. Robert's books have been translated, I have to mention this, French, Spanish, Italian, German, Finnish, Korean, Polish, Portuguese, and Bahasa Indonesia. I don't know what that means. Maybe Robert can tell us what Bahasa Indonesia is. Okay, so a couple of quotes. What do others say about Robert? Oriana Fallaci, who's a personal hero of mine, as Robert is a hero of mine. Oriana says, my comrade in arms, my pal, my buddy. Well, if you're Oriana Fallaci's buddy, you're in pretty good company. I am Hershey Ali writes, no one has upset the Islamophobia cabal more than Robert Spencer. First, he knows more about Islamic doctrine than they do. How true is that? Next, he has outed all the tricks that they use in their bag to disinform the public. Finally, most importantly, Robert will not be cowed. And I can say this when I talk about Robert being a hero, he's just had multiple death threats throughout the 20 years that I've known Robert. He's been poisoned. He was poisoned in Iceland at one time. He's been attacked. Robert comes under daily threats. And yet he perseveres, he cannot be cowed, and he really is, maybe we'll give a presidential, the medal to Robert Spencer. We'll talk to him about that. And I love that, I don't have the book in front of me. If you've got the book, Dennis Prager wrote saying that this is the best book on anti-Semitism ever written. That is really high praise for Dennis Prager. But there are some negatives. This is a quote from an associate professor at Boston University. Robert is the grand poobah of the legend of American Islamophobes. So, if you remember, I don't know, maybe we're all old enough to remember the Flintstones, but the grand poobah was a Flintstones reference, so Robert remembers. Satanic ignoramus, that's Khalil Muhammad. The newspaper in Saudi Arabia said he's the Likud Antichrist. That's pretty serious. And then finally, one of the Al-Qaeda representatives called him a Zionist crusader, missionary of hate, and a counter-Islam consultant. So I am very proud to have a Islam consultant with us here this evening. He's going to talk about his new book on anti-Semitism. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Robert Spencer.
In any case, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Mike, for that very generous introduction. And the occasion is indeed the book Antisemitism, History and Myth, which is just out. And I wanted to explain first off that I wrote this because after October 7th, I was talking to a couple of old friends separately and was quite shocked when they started to say things like, well, you know, yes, it was a terrible attack, but really what Israel is doing is far worse. And you don't hear about it because the Jews control the media. And I said, what? The Jews control? Have you read the New York Times? If the Jews control the media, they're doing an awfully inept job of it. And in any case, it became clear as the weeks after October 7th unfolded that these guys were very serious about this, people I had once respected and worked with. And so I thought, if this is an indication of what's going on, and I think it is, in the United States and the West, then there needs to be an attempt at pushback, because it was astonishing to me that some of these very old anti-Semitic ideas were suddenly popping back up. And in order to understand why this is happening and what we can do about it, we have to first understand where it all comes from. And it starts really with conformism, which is a universal human tendency. And all of us, to some degree, are conformists. It's not a word that we would ever really choose for ourselves, or something that we would say, I'm proud of conforming. And yet, human beings do conform in all kinds of ways. We are all dressed in a certain way here tonight. And the gentlemen in the audience generally have jackets. Some have ties, as I do. And nobody's wearing a jalaba or a dashiki or something of that kind, because that's not generally what we wear in this part of the world in this day and age. It's no judgment on anybody else. It's just not how we dress. We dress this way. There's nothing wrong with that or right with how anybody else dresses. It's just the way it is. And you can take conformism and apply it to so very many things in human behavior. It's really one of the things that keeps communities together, that communities all tend to act in certain ways in the same way, eat the same sorts of foods, have the same kinds of beliefs, have the same perspectives on different things, and generally, often, those who hold different perspectives are looked down upon. And like I say, this can be something that can be very lethal, but it can be something completely innocuous. And I believe that the problem of anti-Semitism ultimately goes back to the fact that the Jews as a people have refused to conform to the larger society in every place they have been in the world where they have been a minority in a larger society. And that has been because of the particularities of the Jewish identity as being very consciously the people called and chosen by the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, who told them that they are to be set apart. And so they have been set apart. Now, here again, this is not a judgment in any either positively or negatively at this point. It's just a statement of fact. But if you look at the four primary causes of anti-Semitism, the four chief roots of anti-Semitism, which I discuss each of them at length in the book, you'll see that ultimately what it comes down to is the refusal of the Jews to conform to a larger group among whom they live, but of which they are not a part. Now, this is a necessity for survival in the first place, because all the groups that might have been minorities within those larger groups that did conform and become indistinguishable from the larger group, they disappeared from history because they became part of the larger group, which was the one thing that God told the Jews not to do. but to remain apart. And so you have in the first place Christianity. So I should say at the outset that I myself, contrary to popular belief, am not Jewish, and I am a believing Christian. At the same time, I recognize that there has been Christian anti-Semitism, and I'm also proud of the fact that some of the major Christian leaders, the Pope and the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople for the Orthodox Church, of which I'm a member, and others, have repudiated Christian anti-Semitism. But it also has very deep roots in a long history that goes back, of course, to the very ancient charge that the Jews killed Christ. And of course, the concomitant charge that the Jews, just by remaining Jews and not becoming Christians, by rejecting Christ, were becoming, in a certain sense, the emblematic and foremost rejectors of this new faith. In any case, there's a fundamental incoherence in Christian anti-Semitism that I think has been far too seldom remarked upon. And that is this. In the Christian scheme of things, the idea is that Christ bears the sins of the people and redeems them from their sins. And that everybody's sins is what put Christ on the cross. If you're a Christian or you've studied Christianity at all, you know this is basic Christianity. It's common to Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Protestantism, and so on. And that everybody by sinning is contributing to putting Christ on the cross. And then Christian anti-Semites will turn around and say, but the Jews did it, and it's their fault. And they bear a particular guilt for killing Christ. Well, if everybody's sins killed Christ, then the Jews don't bear a particular guilt for it. And if the Jews do bear a particular guilt for it, then you can't really say that it is everyone's sins who put him on the cross. And so Christian anti-Semitism, I believe, actually contradicts Christianity at its core. And this is something that has only in the latter day been recognized when the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church repudiated anti-Semitism in the 1960s, and other modern Christian leaders did so. But Christian anti-Semitism is, yes, it ain't gonna stay. Maybe you had know the secret. Oh. No? I could hold it. Would that help?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
If I held it?
Yeah.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen. We've got a great show for you tonight. In any case, Christian anti-Semitism, based on the idea that the Jews killed Christ, led to all manner of pogroms and persecutions, discrimination and harassment over the centuries in Europe, and ultimately came down to, up until the 20th century, the idea that if they would just convert, then everything would be okay. So you see, ultimately it comes back to convert, conform to the larger community, and everything will be fine. Which the Jews quite rightly responded, well, then we would lose our particular identity, which we were given by God, and consequently we can't do that. This is not going to work either? It is? Okay, thank you. $300, please. Anyway, so that's the Christians. It's the same thing when it comes to Islam. In Islam, Muhammad is the final prophet, and he brings the final book, the Quran, confirming what is in the Torah and the Gospel. The Torah and the Gospel being envisioned in the Quran as being the confirmation, the Torah and the Gospel rather being books that were given to Moses and Jesus respectively. Now that's not the Christian understanding, which is that the Gospel is the good news of Christ himself. But in the Islamic understanding, the Gospel is a book that Allah handed to Jesus. And he gave Moses the Torah, and he gave Muhammad the Quran. And all of their messages are the same. And then the wicked Jews and the wicked Christians rejected Muhammad and the Quran. and thus they are to be warred against and subjugated under the hegemony of Islam, so that they will, by the deprivation they suffer in this world, be made to understand the price of rejecting Allah and will repent and convert. So there again you have, if you will just convert, everything will be okay. If you will give up your particularity and join the larger group, then everything will be okay. And there's some very prominent Jewish converts to Islam in the modern age. Adam Gadon, who, Mike, did you mention that Al-Qaeda invited me to accept Islam? Well, that was Adam Gadon. He was this kid out of Oregon, a Jewish kid, who converted to Islam, and he made a video inviting me and Daniel Pipes and Steve Emerson to convert to Islam, which, you know, it was sweet of him really to think of us. The fact is that is a prelude to killing us, because he understands that in Islamic law, first you invite the unbelievers to accept Islam, then if they refuse, you go to war against them. So he was just getting a pretext to kill us, but a drone got him first. Anyway, the thing about the Jews, though, with Islam is that it's even more problematic, because people don't realize nowadays exactly how deeply hateful toward the Jews the Islamic texts are. And there's actually even a scholar nowadays who is quite popular, and I debated him years ago at UCLA before they started canceling everybody. And he contends that there was no anti-Semitism in the Islamic world until the Nazis brought it. Now this is completely, you have to not know anything about the Quran or Islam or Islamic history to be able to contend that. And as I show in the book, the Quran calls the Jews the worst enemies of the Muslims. It's chapter 5, verse 82. Says that Allah transformed the disobedient Jews into apes and pigs, which is obviously dehumanizing in the modern parlance. It calls upon Muslims to wage war against them, and throughout the Hadith, the traditions of Muhammad, they're pretty much blamed for everything. Always scheming against the Muslims, always making more trouble for the Muslims. And consequently, when you look at today's state of Israel, you cannot understand that conflict unless you understand Quranic anti-Semitism, because that's the prism through which the Palestinians and their allies see it. And when they see Israel, they don't see, oh, here are these people who were persecuted and exiled for 2,000 years and they came back to their homeland. They see these are the enemies of the Muslims causing more trouble, and Allah calls us to wage war against them and drive them out from where they drove us out. And that's all in the Quran. So Islamic anti-Semitism is quite virulent, but there again, if the Jews would just convert, if they would conform to the larger society, everything would be okay. The third cause of anti-Semitism nowadays is National Socialism. I don't like to call it Nazism because it was a kind of socialism. And people obscure that. It was actually the Western left that started calling it Nazism all the time instead of National Socialism. Nazi is just an abbreviation. And Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister for the Third Reich, he wrote a little pamphlet called Der Nazi Sozi, which meant the National Socialists. And they ultimately became known as the Nazis. But they were the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And then the fourth one is international socialism. And National Socialism and international socialism differ from one another only in terms of, or primarily I should say, in terms of not that there should be socialism or not. It's not a left-right thing. They're both socialists. They both envisioned an ideal state being a welfare state with a massive government that controls everything. But in National Socialism, private enterprise remains private. It's not all nationalized. But everything is directed toward the aims of the state anyway. It's just nominally in private hands. So you don't have everyone impoverished as everyone becomes a slave of the state, but they're a slave of the state anyway. They just keep a little bit more of their money and nominal ownership over the means of production. But the National Socialists were and are a race-based idea with the Jews as the evil race. Now, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian writer, he said in the 20th century that the dividing line, we have to remember, and it's all too easy to forget, that the dividing line between good and evil does not run between one group of people and another. It runs down the middle of every human heart. Everybody is capable of good and everybody is capable of evil. And that being the case, Solzhenitsyn would say, if he were consistent, which he wasn't always, that anti-Semitism would have to be ruled out. But the Nazis, the National Socialists, made it the basis of their thought that there was one race that was pure, the Aryans so-called, and one race that was completely tainted and was as evil as they were portrayed in Islamic anti-Semitism, and that was the Jews. International socialism is almost identical to that, communism, although it's not understood. Just like Islam, people don't generally understand it as anti-Semitic. And a lot of times when you read anti-Semitic literature, as I did an awful lot in researching this book, you see very common people saying, well, the early Bolsheviks, they were all Jews. And you can look and see, yeah, Trotsky, and, well, there must have been a few others. Yeah, there were a few others, but Lenin was not Jewish, Stalin was not Jewish, etc., etc. It was not a Jewish movement. Actually, international socialism, it's ironic that people identify it with Judaism and Jews, anti-Semites do anyway, because Marx himself wrote that the Jews are equal to the capitalists, that they are the quintessential capitalists, and identified them 100% with finance capital, and consequently said, in order to establish the workers' paradise and true communism, the Jews have to be eliminated. Now, he did not necessarily mean all murdered, he meant conforming to the larger collective. They give up all the distinctives of being Jewish and become communists without any particular practices or particular outlook. And this was absolutely necessary because he identified them so strongly with capitalism. So in all four cases you see, it's always the Jews are identified as the unassimilable group that will not conform to the larger group and thus has to be eliminated in one way or another. Now, nowadays, we see a tremendous recrudescence of all four of these. And I was dismayed as an Orthodox Christian to see, if you go on Twitter, the largest, most influential voices with the most followers among Orthodox Christians are furiously anti-Semitic, posting photos of Hitler. And, I mean, it's just outrageous. And there's that. There is Islamic anti-Semitism, of course, that we see all over after October 7th, with the pro-Hamas protesters in the United States demonstrating outside Jewish businesses, outside Jewish-owned establishments that have nothing to do with Israel or Zionism. It just happens that the person running them is Jewish. And that's enough, because it's really the Jews that they're after, and the idea that they're just fighting Zionists is a fig leaf. And then you have National Socialism reoccurring with people as prominent as Tucker Carlson, platforming this historian, Darryl Cooper, who was actually repeating talking points from Hitler's regime in demonizing Churchill and saying that he just wanted to, that Hitler wanted to unify Europe against the capitalists, there again, he was a socialist, against the capitalists in Britain who were bleeding Europe dry for their own economic purposes, and so on, and minimizing the Holocaust, saying that it was just a matter of the German gains in Russia being so great that they didn't have places to keep all the prisoners, and so the prisoners started starving to death. And all these things, those are things the Nazis actually said, the National Socialists actually said at the time. And so you have that coming back. And then, of course, you have the left anti-Semitism that may be the largest at this point. And that is
And that is the largest element of all this nowadays, because you have a tremendous effort on the part of socialist internationalists today to destroy the nation state. And if you look at Biden and 4 years of an open border and millions of migrants coming in, that wasn't just to get Democratic votes. That was to destroy the national character and culture of the United States so that it would be more malleable and easier to establish an authoritarian regime that would transcend borders and be a truly internationalist state. Same thing happening in Britain right now, same thing happening in Europe, on the European continent. And it is practically unremarked but unmistakable that these socialist internationalists, who we call the globalists, we call the left, we call the Democratic Party, they hate Israel and hate Jews. And it's for the same reason, because they are the foremost people in the world who maintain their own identity. And when you're a collectivist, you don't want people to maintain their own identity. You want to impose a single identity on all of them. You remember Chairman Mao's China, and how even everybody from Chairman Mao down to the person who was taking out the garbage in the office of Chairman Mao, they all wore the same clothes, right? Those little uniforms. Why? Because the left is collectivist. They would do that in the United States if they got the chance. They would do that anywhere. China, in doing that, was just acting out the core assumptions of the left's ideas, that equity has to be imposed, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion. What's equity? It's not just equality of access, equality of opportunity, it's equality of outcome. So see, you might work harder than me, you might be smarter than me, you might be luckier than me, and you might make a whole lot more money than I do, and then the state that is interested in equity is going to seize some of your money and give it to me so we have the same amount. That's equality of outcome. And that's the socialist state in its essence, that we are all forced onto an equal basis. We're all poor and we're all struggling. And so, this collectivist idea, this idea of equity, you have a people that won't conform, that won't submit, that won't assimilate, it doesn't work. And so it's kind of ironic that there is so much support among the Jews in the United States for the left. I respectfully suggest they maybe haven't thought it through, because the left is fundamentally hostile to the very idea of a Jewish identity at all. And that is because of their inherent collectivism. And so, these four tendencies are all at play now. I don't think it was a spontaneous thing any more than the campus protests for Hamas, or what Senator Fetterman of Pennsylvania, who's been a marvelous surprise over the last year and a half, he said that they all think they're making a difference by going into pup tents for Hamas. And I thought it was a wonderful phrase, but the pup tents for Hamas are worthy of note because somebody bought them. It's funny how they all had the same tent. They didn't just spontaneously all have the same tent. And so the point is, this all is being paid for by forces that I do not know. I don't think anybody knows ultimately. Probably one name leaps to mind, and we're probably right about it. But in any case, this is a concerted effort. And I would suggest that it's a concerted effort on the part of powerful forces in the international left today. Because if they destroy Israel and they destroy the United States, then all the rest of the nation states will fall into line. And they will be able to establish their socialist internationalist collective. And so that is the ultimate goal of this recrudescence of anti-Semitism today. So thank you very much. I'll stop there, and if you have any questions or comments, we'll go from that. Now consider this. Imagine that you are a Marxist, socialist, an internationalist. You want to destroy the nation state. You want to establish a socialist state. You want to have total control over the human beings in this state. But you recognize that religion is a very powerful and universal human impulse. And everybody's got one. Even the atheists. They just don't call it that. But everybody's got a religion. And you tried to destroy religion. You did that in the French Revolution. It didn't work. You tried that in the Soviet Union, and it didn't work. And so you're not just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over again. You're going to try a different tactic. So what about, instead of destroying religion, which you have realized you cannot do, instead you decide to choose one of the existing religions, one that happens to inculcate absolute obedience to the ruler, and push that religion on everybody else. Now think about this. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, there's a very famous saying where he says, "Obey your ruler, even if he is an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin." And people quote that to say, look, he was a racist. Yes, he was a racist, if he existed at all. Whoever wrote that was a racist, sure. But that's not the most important aspect of the statement. The most important aspect of the statement is obey your ruler, even if. Obey your ruler, in other words, no matter what. Even if he's the most outlandish person that can be thought of, you have to obey him. And Islam lends itself to absolutism, also because of the very idea of Allah, who's this very angry, willful despot who has no restraints. You know, Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, writes about his frustration in dealing with the Muslim philosophers because they wouldn't accept that A is A. The Aristotelian idea that the book is the book. It's not a horse. And they would say, well, Allah could make it into a horse tomorrow. Well, yes, he could. But then you can't really predicate anything about the universe, which is why Islamic science never actually developed. It's a myth. Science developed in Christian Europe because they understood that a good God would create the universe according to consistent and discernible laws. But in the Islamic world, they thought Allah is absolute will, and consequently, he can do whatever he wants, and you can't count on this universe being the same way tomorrow as it is today. And so Maimonides found them entirely frustrating to deal with. But the idea of science grew up not in the Islamic world for precisely this reason. Anyway, Allah is absolute will, and he has to be obeyed. So this lends itself to absolutism. All right? Now, if you look at history, when have there been secular democracies in the Islamic world? Never. There was one. There was Turkey. 20 years ago, people would say, Turkey is going to be the trendsetter, and it's all going to be okay. In 20 years, they'll all be secular democracies. And now Turkey is re-Islamizing. It was always at war with political Islam. Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, explicitly rejected political Islam because he thought it was responsible for the failure of the Ottoman Empire. And he built modern Turkey on the model of the secular West. But that has been rejected now, not only everywhere else in the Islamic world, but in Turkey as well. So anyway, imagine you have these socialist internationalists. They love Islam because Islam makes for a docile population that will accept tyranny. It always has. And so they encourage Islam, and they bring mass huge numbers of Muslim migrants into the West. And so they don't mind that they won't assimilate. They think they can co-opt them. They're in for a rude awakening. Khomeini allied with the communists, and the communists thought, we're going to have a part in the new government. And then he put them all in prison and killed them. And it'll be the same way. If we lose in the struggle for freedom in the West, then the Muslims will turn on the leftists and kill them. But meanwhile, the leftists think they can ride the tiger. Yes, sir. Hey, Brent. Thank you. Thank you.
And a special thank you for your critical Quran. the outstanding translation of the Devil's Book, the Quran. It's really a must-read, even though it's 800 pages, but it's easy to read.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Now I can say, yes, I'm the author of the Quran. Although really, it's not really something you want on your resume.
And so what you're saying, it seems like you're talking a lot about the superstructure of anti-Semitism, but I don't know if you're familiar with the writer, director, filmmaker, Rabbi Raphael Shore.
Sure.
Who just came out with a new thing, Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Jew, built more on the idea that the Torah and Hitler agree why there's anti-Semitism. And it's because the Jews brought conscience, morality, empathy, and ethics to the world, and barbarians can't tolerate that. So whenever you're dealing with a barbaric people, it could be Muslims, it could be Nazis, communists, it can be Jews. There are a lot of people I call jihadi Jews now, the leftist Marxist Jews of the university. And so whoever hates God really has to hate the Jew, symbolically. It goes through there.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have any problem with that. I think that makes perfect sense.
Good evening, thank you.
Thank you.
Two things. I'm going to ask you first to parse a civics lesson between the three Abrahamic faiths. You cited the Quranic injunction to obey the leader, albeit the leader's a pinhead. Yesu ben Yosef is attributed to have said in the gospel, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God. In the Pirkei Avot, part of the Talmud, it says, you have entered the city, abide by its customs. So we have three civic lessons here in terms of the relationship of the individual subordinate to the state. Can you differentiate them?
Yeah, sure, I think so. Anyway, at the risk of hubris, I suppose. But in any case, when you come to the first one, I think I explained that it lends itself to absolutism and to the idea of total obedience and totalitarianism in society. That is, the Islamic injunction, it's not actually in the Quran, it's in the Hadith. Muhammad saying, obey your ruler even if he's an Ethiopian with a head like a raisin. Then Jesus saying, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, is of course a much debated saying that many people take as the foundation of the much later idea that did originate in Europe of secular government. That there are areas of the of the government of peoples that are best kept religiously neutral. And this was a result in Europe, of course, of the religious wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, where it was ultimately decided that the individual conscience should be respected to the degree that there would be well, as the Quran puts it, no compulsion in religion, although the Quran doesn't really mean it. But the idea is that the dignity of the human person as created in the image of God is such that the individual's choice is to be respected even if one disagrees. And there's a realm in which there's a religious realm and a secular realm in the government that respects the individual conscience of the varying people with varying points of view. And that has enabled the pluralistic societies of today. And then the third, well, I believe that that's certainly a true statement from Pirkei Avot, that you respect the rules of the house and so on. But at the same time, if that were carried out to its logical conclusion, then you would have no more Jewish people, because they would be respecting, like I said in the talk, conforming so totally as to give up their particular identity. And so that's always something that I think has had limits within the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, thank you. My view of Islam, or understanding the evolution of Islam, is that basically it took the Jewish messianic idea, and Muhammad is essentially a messianic figure, that the Mashiach is the last messenger of God to announce the messianic age. So they basically took this Jewish principle, which I guess is post-Babylonian exile, and said, okay, this messianic figure has arrived, this is the last messenger. So it's really Mashiach by other means, or recast for that culture.
You could say that, but Muhammad occupies an even greater position in Islam than any messianic traditions that I'm aware of in Judaism or in Christianity for that matter. Because, well, you know, I think that, to put it kind of crudely, in many talks I've said that Allah in Islam is Muhammad's sock puppet. That if you read the Islamic traditions, Allah is so deeply concerned for the happiness and well-being of Muhammad that it's very clear that whether these traditions were originally about Muhammad or about somebody else, as I contend in Muhammad, A Critical Biography, and Did Muhammad Exist, that this was a con man who was using his claim to be a prophet of God to give himself all manner of special privileges to a degree that's absolutely ludicrous, such that the whole universe is revolving around the happiness of this one guy. And it's crazy.
Thank you.
But that's another discussion for another day.
We're going to try to get these 3 last questions.
Okay, I'll try to be more brief.
Hi, I have a question for someone, actually a group of people who couldn't be here, and then one is for myself. So I'm actually from UCLA, and there were like a few people who just saw like quotes from your blogs, and they were just wanting to look out for Muslim friends who were actually like, there's a lot of anti-Semitism, but there's also plenty of Muslims on campus who aren't anti-Semitic, and then who are anti-Semitic, but they've been getting attacked simply because of certain quotes that are like definitely coded, but it's not really descriptive of their like entire identity or their set of values. And so my personal question is, even though there are certain verses within the book that can be, you know, like people can raise awareness about it, okay, we should stay away from this. But when bringing it up in the conversation, like how can it be done in a safe way where people aren't like demonized and they aren't like being attacked? And then the second question is, what would you have to say to people who think you're Islamophobic?
Can I do the second one first?
Yeah.
Islamophobia is a made-up word designed to intimidate people into being afraid to speak out against jihad, terrorism, and violence committed in the name of Islam and in accord with its teachings. It's designed to intimidate and frighten people into silence. That's what I would say to people who say I'm Islamophobic. If what I were saying were not true, if the quotes that I give from the Quran and Muhammad were not true, were not in there, if Muslims weren't acting upon them and quoting them themselves to commit acts of violence all around the world, even today, then there might be a case. But otherwise, it's a term that is designed to inhibit speech and thought, and as such should be resolutely rejected. Mm-hmm. As far as...
Can I actually, sorry to interrupt, can I add like one more comment on that? There's like 2 different things. I agree with your definition of Islamophobia, but there's another Islamophobia that some UCLA students are afraid of, and it's not the one that you were speaking of. It's the Islamophobia that, anybody wearing like a head covering like a woman, they're just immediately looked as, oh, she believes in this, and it's like more of like a fear of immediate like assumption, you know?
Yeah, actually, Islamophobia is also an illegitimate conflation of 2 quite distinct phenomena. One is vigilante attacks against innocent people, which of course are always to be rejected. And the other is honest discussion about the roots, the ideological roots of jihad violence. And the same word is used deliberately and maliciously for both in order to conflate the 2 and to give the impression that if you speak honestly about what the content of the Islamic texts and Islamic teachings, that you are thereby condoning or even inciting violence. Well, actually, no, that's not the case. The only incitement of violence is when there's an actual call to violence. And that's true all around. I would not just say that of myself, but of anybody in the world. Muslim, non-Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist. If you say go and attack people, that's incitement to violence. If you say these people are advancing ideas that are based on a holy text that teaches that these people are the enemy and have to be warred against, and if that's true and accurate, then there's no violence in that. And one of the biggest problems on campuses today, UCLA and others, is the conflation of speech and violence. Speech is not violence. And if I am speaking honestly and accurately about the Islamic texts and teachings, that's not violence. If I say go attack somebody, that's incitement to violence. But I've never said that, and I never would say that because I don't believe in that. And so the people who maliciously want to suppress honest discussion of these issues equate speech with violence and say, when you say this, that the Islamic texts say that the Quran says kill them wherever you find them, over and over again in chapter 2, verse 191, 489, 491, 9:5, and then 47:4 says when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks. If I say that, I'm not saying go and do anything to anybody. I'm saying this is what the Quran says. But they want you to believe that if I say that, then some poor innocent guy who's a Muslim on campus is going to get attacked. Why? I didn't tell anybody to attack anybody. And he might not believe those things. Or he might not take them seriously. Or he might have no intention of acting upon them. And so the big problem we have nowadays is that the universities are deliberately, they're not just not teaching how to think, they're deliberately teaching you how to think wrong. And one of the ways they are doing that is by making you think that speech that is unpopular and unwelcome in certain circles is incitement to violence. It isn't. Incitement to violence is incitement to violence. Speech that is unpopular is speech that is unpopular, and that's all that it is.
We're going to try to get the last two
Yep.
questions. Thank you.
Yeah, mine's quick. In regards to basically lately in the news with Ireland, I know there's sort of been how much of the anti-Israel sentiment there is from the groundswell of Muslims that have kind of flooded that country, and how much
about
of it is
100%.
Huh? No.
About 100%.
How much of it is also just the where the Catholics, the Protestants, we were pro-Israel, and the Protestants were pro-Israel, so we're against them. The Catholics were pro-Palestinian, so we're for that. And are there any voices in the Irish Parliament that are pro-Israel? Because if there are, I haven't heard them.
I don't know of any, but I haven't been looking all that closely. I don't know everybody in the Irish Parliament. But certainly there's probably an undercurrent of Christian anti-Semitism that's always been there and hasn't been entirely suppressed over the last half century. I think that's very much a possibility. But the big resurgence in Europe and in the UK and Ireland of anti-Semitism comes from the mass Muslim migration and the left's attempts to accommodate the Muslims because they love them for the reasons I explained earlier. Final question.
And I will be short, I promise.
I will be, but I always am.
How does the... Yeah, I please go on and on. How does the West protect itself, and indeed, how does the West win?
How does the West protect itself and win? It has to reject the socialist internationalism that led to all this. And so, for example, Trump has closed the border, and that's good, but there are a whole lot of people here who think he's terrible, not here, who think he's terrible for having closed the border, who think that everything he's done has to be reversed, and they will keep fighting. And there's plenty more, of course, that they are still doing to corrode the native culture, to corrode the unity of the people, to make socialist authoritarianism easier to implement. And so we have to fight resolutely against that and be aware of that as happening, when most people aren't even aware that it is going on. But you have to understand the open border. If you forget, think about the open border. It wasn't just for Democratic voters. It was to dilute the national character and weaken the country in general so that it would fall and it would be easier to establish the authoritarian regime they want. These people are not idiots. They're evil, but they're not stupid. And so they wouldn't be so short-sighted as to bring in millions of people thinking they'll vote Democratic when there wouldn't even be a vote to have if they all stayed here and changed the system the way that they were likely to do. And so anyway, we got to close. Thank you so much.
Thank
for
you,
being
Robert.
here, and God bless you.